This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Welcome to the show. This episode is titled, Whose Oil Is It Anyway? A not so subtle nod to the famous improv comedy show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? If you're not familiar, Whose Line worked like this. Topics are based on audience suggestions or predetermined prompts from the host. And from there, a panel of performers would improvise based on a particular situation. Coincidentally, the oil you buy off the shelf also has predetermined characteristics, and the team at Blackstone delivers a report with analysis specific to your particular situation. But unlike on an episode of Whose Line, the points, or in this case test results, do matter and help determine if the oil is right for you. So, if you've just bought a car and don't know anything about the oil it came with, or maybe you aren't sure what the shop used and want the lowdown on what the oil looks like in testing, or if you're just in the mood for petroleum-based entertainment, this show is for you. Before we dive into the main event, a couple of housekeeping matters. First of which, if you don't know already, we have Slick Talk swag available on our website, blackstone-labs.com. Cruise over there, go under the products tab, and you can find Slick Talk swag, specifically hats and shirts, available on our website. Secondly, if you, the listener, have any swag ideas that you would like to see available in the future, call our hotline, 614-407-6169. Send those ideas along. Now for the main event, how oil analysis can and can't be of use when determining what oil you've got. We're going to kick things off with the viscosity. It's part of our standard analysis, and we measure the oil's viscosity when the oil's at operating temp. First things first, know your range. Is the oil you're sampling supposed to be a 520 or a 540, for instance? We can tell you where the viscosity is, so knowing what it should have been to start with is key. If you tell us it's a 540 and it measures in the 540 range, then you're good to go, at least from a viscosity standpoint. Now, keep in mind the viscosity can change due to a variety of factors. So if there's coolant, for example, well, then the viscosity may end up thick, and as such, doesn't necessarily mean the viscosity was wrong or the wrong oil was used, but that the viscosity was thick as a result of contamination. You want to look at these surrounding factors when understanding if a result is evidence of the wrong oil being in use. In addition to contaminations such as coolant, you'll also want to consider if, for example, the engine has a propensity for shearing the oil down. It's another factor to take into consideration before making any hard and fast calls just based on where the viscosity ended up. Some engines, such as the 6.0 liter Power Stroke I've brought up many times on this show, some smaller turbocharged engines as well, the viscosity can be low even in the absence of contamination, and we know what a low viscosity looks like for those engines in the sense that if it's slightly below spec, we don't see the contamination that could be thinning it, and it's a viscosity that also looks typical for other used oil samples from that engine type, then it's safe to assume that shearing was a likely factor. You want to know about additives too, if any. For instance, there are additives such as Lucas that can thicken the oil up, harmlessly so, but nevertheless that can interfere with the viscosity measuring in the range that you expected it to. And you'll also want to be aware of any solvent-based products. Think about a flush, for example. If you use a flush, it can impact the viscosity and the flash point, which in turn can cause the oil to not meet a certain spec, but just because the oil doesn't have the desired flash point or viscosity doesn't mean the wrong oil was in use. You want to be aware of any additives before resting on the viscosity alone. So cover the bases and let us know what's been in use. Some additives skew results, but A lot of them do not. So if you know the additives that have been in use, include that information on your oil slip, and in turn will factor in the particular additive you noted when determining if it looks like this is indeed the oil that you want it to be. Before I leave the viscosity entirely, I want to talk about what I call the overlap caveat. A 520 will certainly measure differently than a 540. I think that would make sense to a lot of you, given the difference between 20 and 40. But there is not a significant difference when the oil's at operating temp and say you're comparing a 020 and a 520. A 0 is going to be thinner than a 5 when it's cold, but once the oil is at operating temp, these two are virtually indistinguishable. As such, we may mention in a used oil report that a viscosity fits into multiple ranges, and that's not meant to confuse you or act as if we don't know. A limiting factor that should be taken into consideration if you're in a bind and trying to use the viscosity to prove the wrong or the right oil was in use. These oils are so similar, though, that I would have a hard time working up any sort of concern if, say, you want to know, is it a 020, is it a 520? These oils are so similar, and yes, there is a difference when they're very cold, but once they're at operating temp, which is when the oil's doing most of its work, cleaning and lubricating the engine, these two are so similar that I can't foresee an instance where, let's say, there's a 020 in use and it was supposed to be a 520 would result in some catastrophic wear to the engine. Just be aware that when these oils are at operating temp, there can be some overlap amongst the 020s, the 520s, a 1040, a 540. There is going to be a shared range between these two where the viscosity can work for either one. And we'll let you know if it can work for either one. And that's not to say we don't know, as much as that is a limiting characteristic and there's really no way around it. If an oil meets multiple ranges, that's the way it is. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about an oil that could be a 040 or a 540, let's say. Now I want to go back to additives, but instead of a product like Lucas or a Flush, I'm going to talk about additives that are in the oil to begin with. There's going to be a great deal of variation in the additive elements from some brands to others. And then you'll have certain brands and blends that look a lot alike in testing in terms of their additive makeup. But in instances where one oil looks noticeably different from another, sending in a virgin sample for comparison can be quite useful if you want to determine, hey, is this the oil that the shop said it is? Here's what they're using. It's an unused sample they said they put in my car, and then here's the oil that is in my car. I want to know if these two look alike or if this appears to be a different oil. Sometimes the answer can lie in the additive elements when you have two brands that can look very different in testing. Now, some of them are going to be hard to tell apart, and that's because manufacturers are using similar recipes in the sense of, you're going to have those detergent dispersant, those anti-wear additives, and all the oils. It just depends on what brand is using what element at what level compared to another. And sometimes there's a great deal of overlap, but there can be very distinctive additive packages. I've talked a lot about sodium on this show and how some oils like Valvoline might use a great deal of it, Brad Pen being another. And then you'll have a lot of other gasoline engine oils that use no sodium at all, like AMSOIL doesn't use a significant amount. So if you were to compare an AMSOIL sample to a Brad Pen, you're likely going to see very obvious separation in the additive lineup. So you can use additives to help determine what that oil is. If it appears to be the brand or blend that someone told you it is, we can go to those additive elements, and sending in that unused sample for comparison can be helpful. We have, of course, seen the vast majority of oils before, but sometimes it's tricky when you get down to a particular blend, because often customers will just note, it's AMSOIL or it's Liquimoly, it's Pennzoil, but likely as a listener of this show, that Pennzoil has a lot of different products, as do most other manufacturers. So Pennzoil has a lot of different blends, as do other brands. So just be aware of the exact product you've got And we'll let you know if we haven't seen it, if we have no reference point for it. And in any case, if you want a direct comparison as concrete as it can get, then sending in an unused sample will be useful to you. And don't hesitate to call ahead and ask if we're familiar with a brand, blend, and additive, just to make sure. If it's oil that we simply haven't seen, we'll let you know. I would encourage you to always call ahead if there is a pressing matter that you're sending this sample in for. Don't wait till the sample arrives. We've completed our standard analysis, especially in a case where you aren't quite sure what to ask for on the slip. So you maybe don't fill out any particular concerns. You're not sure how to word it. Call ahead or email if you'd rather. You can send us a DM on Instagram, send us a message on Facebook, whatever route you want to take. If you have a pressing matter that is calling for you to send in this sample in the first place, I would call and make sure we offer the testing that you need if it's a very specific answer. And that way you don't get in a situation where you've been waiting all this time for a sample to arrive, and maybe we didn't give the exact answer you're expecting in the comment. It may be a situation where we can provide that answer, and we just focused on other aspects of the report because we didn't know what exactly you're sending in the sample for. Or it may be a case where we can provide some data points. Maybe it's not the exact data you were expecting. We can avoid all of this if we know from the jump what you're sending the sample in for, and then, of course, we will tailor the analysis, the comment that we send out with each report to your needs, and that way you have the right answer right away. Earlier, I mentioned how a viscosity may be thick or thin for the expected range and how additives can play a role in that. You also want to be aware of contaminants such as fuel dilution. So fuel dilution will thin the oil down. We test for fuel using the flashpoint. So if you haven't used a solvent-based product, and it's not an engine like the 6.0 Power Stroke. Again, there's not a ton of engines that shear the oil down. It's just something I like to bring up as a point you need to take into consideration when you're sending in a sample. But keep in mind, coolant thickens the oil up. If anything, it won't always thicken it up, but if it is going to have any impact on the viscosity, coolant's usually going to thicken it. Fuel will thin it down. Of course, depends on how much is present, but that can impact where the viscosity is. So contamination will play a role in how those physical properties end up, and something you want to keep in mind. If you have an engine that has a known fuel system issue, let's say, then it can be tricky to rely on the viscosity to tell you if the right or wrong oil is in use. While engine oils can look a lot alike, that's not to say there aren't examples of oil types that do look particularly distinctive. And that's transmission oils, especially those designed for CVT transmissions. We often see samples of what should be Nissan NS2 or NS3 fluid. These transmissions have such intricate design that using the wrong oil can wreak havoc very quickly, cause failures rapidly, and as such, we'll see a lot of samples from these CVTs where the owners need to know, is this NS2, is this NS3? And of course, this analysis expands to other fluid types, especially Nissan fluid types. So if you're in a case where the transmission you have is, if it's not failing, you notice lacking operation shortly after a fluid change, sending in a sample of the used oil, and then again, as with engine oil, call ahead, ask if we have seen a reference sample for comparison. If we haven't, you can send in an unused sample and we'll see how it compares. But we see a lot of these NS2, a lot of these NS3 samples, and we know what to expect from the additive elements. So here's a case where the viscosity really isn't much use in the sense that a generic CVT fluid is going to look basically indistinguishable from an NS2 and NS3, but the additives really hold the key. We know what to expect from NS2, NS3, and you'll see a very obvious difference usually when these additives do not match up. Boron, calcium, phosphorus. If these additives are either in an unusual balance, if we see levels that are way out of whack with what we should be seeing, we know how these elements should be in the sense of, boron, what is that level in relation to phosphorus, calcium, so on. We know what to expect from these additives. And if we see an improper balance, levels that are unusually high or low, that can speak to contamination. And of course, this is a situation where the eye test can point you in the right direction. It's just not something I'd want to rely on. If you're familiar with these fluids at all, then you know that they can have distinct colors starting out. NS3 is typically going to be blue in color. NS2 is going to be green. And then you'll have ATF, which is red. And if ATF is present, then you'll see an unusually red color for these fluids. So the eye test can point you in the right direction, but often after these fluids have been in use for a while, they're all going to look pretty dark, and it's not going to be distinctive from the eye test. You don't want to rely on that anyway. It's so much more concrete to go with the elements and the levels these elements are at and spectral results before making any hard and fast calls and assuming the wrong fluid is in use. So this has been a lengthy and fairly technical breakdown of what is still a very important topic. So should you have any questions about testing or this episode in particular, please do reach out to our voicemail. Again, that number is 614-407-6169. If you have any questions about this topic or another topic you'd like us to cover, please don't hesitate to call and reach out, and we'll be happy to feature those suggestions on an upcoming episode.